survive for 30 days and earn $300,000. A new gameplay emerges for solitary wilderness living. 3 strangers are dropped into the Arctic as a team. The show provides them with a large animal, and aside from their clothes, they cannot bring any tools. As a flare marking the animal's location is launched, the trio quickly jumps from the yacht and heads towards that position. The sooner they arrive, the better, to avoid black bears or wolves beating them to it. The challenge could end just as it begins. When they find the animal provided by the show, they are all out of breath. Fortunately, it is a 400-pound moose, enough to sustain them for 30 days if properly preserved. Without a moment to rest, their first task is to butcher the moose. Without knives, they search for a suitable rock. Zane, skilled in hunting and fishing, struggles to find a good stone due to the long-term frost coverage making the rocks too brittle. Luckily, Joe, the oldest and skilled in primitive techniques, manages to fashion a stone blade and hands it to Lindsay. Lindsay, more experienced in butchering than the men from hunting with her father since childhood, finds the moose's thick skin challenging to cut with a stone blade. Removing the warm internal organs quickly is crucial to prevent the meat from spoiling. They work together tightly to open the belly and remove the intestines. As dusk approaches, they decide Joe will build a shelter while Lindsay and Zane continue processing the moose. Joe utilizes nearby pine trees to construct a shelter around the tree base using broken branches. No ropes needed. Meanwhile, Lindsay removes the moose's heart and lungs. They leave the moose at the site overnight, hoping no bears find it, as they can only shout from a distance if one does. The next morning at 8:30, Joe feels unwell, possibly from the cold night causing a slight fever and cough. Fortunately, no bears found the moose. Today, they must secure the meat properly. As Lindsay and Joe work, 2 crows circle overhead, a sign to bears of a carcass below. Zane builds a food storage rack on a cliff edge, a more challenging spot for bears to access. By the afternoon, they have processed half the moose, but Joe needs to rest, leaving Lindsay and Zane to finish. They place the severed deer legs on the rack. By day 3, they are very hungry, and without Joe to start a fire, Zane takes over. Using tree branches as a drill and base, and deer skin as a rope, he painstakingly creates friction. After 7 exhausting hours, he finally sparks a flame and carefully transfers it to the tinder, blowing it into a strong fire, a success that delights Lindsay. The 2 immediately used a stone slab to grill the meat. Precious ingredients often do not require any seasoning, especially in a wilderness survival situation where hunger is the best spice. The mere tender and aromatic moose meat was enough for Lindsay and Zane to praise its deliciousness. After filling their stomachs, they didn't forget about Joe. Since he had no appetite, they decided to make him some tea instead. A few sips of hot water might help him feel better. Without a container, they cut open the moose stomach and cleaned it from the inside out at the lakeside, especially the food-contacting inner lining. They secured the water-filled moose stomach with stones and heated rocks inside it to boil the water without damaging the container. To enhance the flavor, they added rose hips and pine needles to the water. Joe felt bitter after drinking the hot tea, realizing his health might not improve without medication. Feeling like a burden, he decided to leave the competition. The next day, Zane and Lindsay fetched water from the lake to boil near the moose carcass, only to find scattered organs around, a sign that a bear had reached the site. Fortunately, the meat stored on the cliff edge was untouched. Despite the low temperatures, unprocessed meat cannot last more than a month without spoiling. They planned to smoke and dehydrate the meat using moose hide to create a smoke duct with a stone at the smoke inlet and a fire underneath. This process would ensure the meat's long-term preservation. That night, a heavy snowfall challenged their crude shelter, letting snow and cold inside. They layered thick pine branches over it the next morning, hoping to keep the snow out. The smoking process went smoothly, and if they could maintain the status quo, Zane and Lindsay believed they could survive a month. However, an unexpected event occurred. Bear roars outside their shelter at night. Bravely, they confronted the bear, marking their first close encounter with one, which unsettled them. On the 10th day, Zane told Lindsay he was leaving, citing homesickness, but the real reason was his fear of bears. Lindsay, left alone, was dismayed but resolved to continue. She managed the challenging tasks and maintained the fire and food supplies, hopeful to last another 20 days. On the 14th day, Lindsay found a bear eating the remaining moose carcass. Knowing the danger of confronting a bear, she waited until it left to drag the carcass away from the camp, hoping to keep the bear at a safe distance. To prepare for emergencies, she attempted to make a bone knife, offering some defense rather than none. That night, the bear returned, approaching within 10 meters of Lindsay, carrying a piece of moose meat, which terrified her. By dawn, she discovered bear tracks all around her shelter. Realizing the danger of staying, she packed everything using the moose hide. Moving the fire was tricky. She hollowed out a birch log, placed ignited fungus inside, and blew on it periodically to keep it smoldering for hours, enough time to find a new campsite. Upon arriving, Lindsay immediately started a fire using the birch log, then constructed a new shelter using a log as the main beam with branches on the sides and moose hide in the middle. The shelter's floor was dry, and she slept there, the long fire providing strong warmth in the freezing weather, covering every detail for survival. On the 23rd day, Lindsay woke up feeling dizzy. Eating dried moose meat every day does not provide all the nutrients the human body needs, not to mention it being tough on the teeth and mouth. She now craved some fresh meat with fat. Lindsay decided to hunt for grouse, having previously brought along a moose scapula, which she found accurate and convenient for throwing. After searching the woods for some time, she finally spotted a grouse. Throwing the scapula, she successfully hit the bird and immediately arranged to roast it over a fire until it was crispy on the outside and tender inside. This was her first taste of fresh food in over half a month, and it was delicious beyond words. By the 30th day, Lindsay successfully completed the challenge. She packed her belongings, extinguished the fire, and went to the lakeshore to fire a flare, signaling her victory and securing the prize money. As the yacht slowly arrived, the second group of contestants disembarked and quickly headed to the drop-off point. The provided game was again a moose. The first task they faced was how to butcher it. Jason, a survival instructor in the U.S. Army, went to the river to select stones but found most unsuitable. He joined the competition to test himself and to share in the prize money. Amy, who had a degree in natural resources technology and was skilled in various crafts, readily took on the task of building the shelter, wanting to set an example for her children. Nathan, skilled in hunting, fishing, and butchering, naturally took on the task of butchering the moose with the stone blade made by Jason, indicating he was sufficient for the job if Jason didn't mind starting the fire. Each person chose a task, aiming to complete them before dark. If they did, the competition would be half won. Jason cut a strip of moose hide to use as a bowstring. The attached fur was problematic because it required much time to punch holes in the base, so he asked Amy to help pluck the fur clean. Amy did so without complaint, dropping her previous task. Nathan's butchering went smoothly. He did not puncture the intestines, and his progress was faster than previous contestants. When Jason completed the bow drill, Amy's shelter was nearly finished. Starting a fire was a survival priority. She helped Jason stabilize the base, allowing him easier movement of the bowstring. Despite seeing wisps of smoke, the damp wood prevented any embers from forming. Nathan had already processed the moose's innards and was ready to skin and cut the meat as soon as a fire was made. Jason was genuinely working hard with the bowstring. The friction and coordination were sufficient, but the wood's moisture was too high. After several hours of effort, they still had no embers, and it was clear they wouldn't succeed that night. By the third day, the fire was still not made, and they had only eaten berries so far. They needed more nutritious food and decided to eat moose bone marrow, which is safe to consume raw without the risk of infection. They cracked open a moose shin, and the greasy marrow tasted quite good. This time, all three worked together to operate the drill, placing a piece of marrow in the hole to increase smoothness. Jason held the pressure board while Amy and Nathan each pulled the skin rope, using great effort to finally produce embers. Using the same familiar method, they finally got a fire going, and their anxiety was relieved. Other tasks were postponed as eating was the priority. Amy stuffed berries into the moose heart and roasted it by the fire, with some venison steaks on a stone slab nearby. Their meal was ready. They were so hungry, the meal tasted exceptionally delicious, with a perfect balance of flavors. Afterward, they planned to utilize every part of the moose. They smashed the tendons in the deer's legs, stripping each fiber to twist into rope, which was tough enough to be difficult to break. Amy used these ropes to sew the moose heart into a pouch that could carry 1.5 liters of water. With the men's help, Every part of the moose was gradually segmented and carried back to camp, using deerskin ropes tied to trees. On the 6th day, heavy snowfall and a sudden drop in temperature made the shelter, which was drafty on all sides, ineffective. The heat from the fire rose, melting the snow on the roof and causing extreme dampness inside, making it unsuitable for habitation. They decided to build a new shelter, using a large slanted tree as the base, framing it with logs on either side, and layering more branches to seal the roof better. Due to spending the previous night in the damp and cold shelter, Amy woke up with a cold the next morning. Particularly, her boots felt twice as heavy after walking outside. As the saying goes, cold starts from the feet and illness enters through the mouth. She sewed deer hide onto her boots to improve their water resistance. By the 9th day, temperatures continued to drop and heavy snow persisted outside. The good news was that the deer meat did not spoil untreated. The bad news was that Amy's cold had worsened. Aside from keeping warm by the fire, her only relief was drinking hot tea. The moose stomach served as a container, but they needed a basket to keep it open. Fortunately, her teammates were considerate. Jason wove 2 baskets from dry grass and gathered berries and herbs, hoping the tea would help Amy recover. The next day, Nathan found blood traces from an animal fight in the snow by the lake. As winter approached and food became scarcer, animals fought desperately for sustenance. They needed to protect their deer meat. Jason and Nathan tied a horizontal pole next to the shelter and hung the remaining 3 deer legs on it, allowing them to quickly locate and drive away any intruders, which was easier than monitoring multiple locations. Eating venison daily, the imbalance between protein and fat intake became apparent. Jason had lost 15 pounds, but he was determined to continue for the prize money. Amy's condition worsened to the point of not wanting to eat or drink and experiencing dizziness and vomiting. By the 14th day, she called for a medical checkup. After blood tests, urine tests, ultrasound, and kidney function tests, the doctor advised hospital treatment to prevent pneumonia. With half the challenge remaining, enduring it could severely aggravate her condition. With tears, Amy was forced to withdraw by the production team. Without Amy's cooperation, Jason and Nathan took turns doing tasks outside, leaving one person at camp to watch the fire. By the 19th day, Nathan noticed numerous wolverine tracks in the snow, heading towards the moose carcass by the lake. Sure enough, the moose left by the lake was gnawed to bones, and even the nose was partially eaten. Knowing the wolverines would likely visit the camp, they decided to make torches to be ready for any encounter. Nathan collected a large amount of pine resin and stuffed dry grass and moss into the split top of a stick, then coated it with melted resin to make a simple torch. They made 2, one longer and one shorter. When they heard noises at the meat-hanging pole at night, they lit the torches and went out but saw nothing. The animal was likely scared off, but they threw the shorter torch to create an impact and placed the longer torch next to the deer legs before returning to sleep. Since then, the wolverines had not approached the camp. The following days passed quietly. They gathered wood, kept the fire going, ate deer meat, and dreamed of the future while repairing the shelter. By the last day, although the process had no major surprises or twists, the cooperation among the contestants was a highlight. Thus, the challenge ended successfully. The next group of contestants began their challenge by locating an airdrop in the forest, which contained a musk ox weighing between 500 to 600 pounds. The area was swarming with insects, and the temperature was not low, meaning the carcass could spoil within 2 days if left as is. Robert attempted to create cutting tools by striking rocks. Having learned various survival skills from his father since childhood, making stone tools was not a difficult task for him. It's worth mentioning contestant Ben, who is the brother of Jordan, the winner of Alone Season 6. He joined the challenge to follow in his brother's footsteps. Nate, with his distinctive beard from Season 8, had to withdraw on the 24th day of his season due to illness caused by drinking water contaminated with squirrel feces. All 3 contestants were competent and had strong backgrounds. Unlike previous contestants, they did not rush to remove the muskox's organs. Although doing so would cool the carcass quickly, which helps in preservation, it would also emit odors that could attract nearby carnivores. The thick and rough skin of the muskox was difficult to peel. It took the 3 several hours just to remove the first leg. Ben carried the leg to the lake. Before they could start a fire, the cold lake water was the best place to preserve the meat. He used stones to anchor it and prevent it from being washed away. On his way back, Ben noticed fresh bear tracks along the shore. With about 4 to 5 hours left until dark, they decided to spend all their time butchering the muskox. They first chopped off the 4 legs and then emptied the organs. By the time they finished, it was almost dark. They took the fat and the heart for dinner. That night, they only laid some branches on the ground. Facing not only the Arctic cold, but also the potential threat of wild beasts, made it a night of little sleep. The next day, when they went to check the meat in the lake, they found only 3 of the 4 legs. The discovery unsettled them. But thankfully, the thief had left tracks. Following these, they found the missing leg in the forest, clearly dragged away by a bear. As expected, just as they returned to the lake to clean the leg, the bear came back, probably to continue its meal. Nate and Ben did not hesitate to confront it, throwing stones and nearly engaging in a physical altercation, which confused and scared the bear back into the woods. Realizing it was no longer safe to keep the meat in the water, they moved it all back to camp and decided to start a fire first. They dug up spruce roots to use as bowstrings. Ben held down the pressure board and base while Robert and Nate repeatedly pulled the drill. Unfortunately, the spruce roots were not durable enough and kept breaking. After several failed attempts, the bear returned. Ben, still frustrated, chased it away with shouts and throws, successfully scaring it off. Since the spruce roots were inadequate, they tried using musk ox hair, which proved successful. The hair-made rope did not break, and they quickly produced a good amount of embers, finally getting a fire going. They then built a large smoking hut to process the meat, cutting it into strips and placing it inside. The sinews they removed were dried to make fishing ropes. Their teamwork was efficient and well coordinated. Although the stone knives caused some injuries, Nate remarked that these were minor compared to the potential prize money. To avoid attracting bears with the musk ox carcass, they burned the remaining skeleton after removing all edible parts. On the 3rd evening, they stopped to roast several pounds of meat. The jerky was tough and had a musky odor, which is how the musk ox gets its name. Despite the flavor not being great, they ate it to replenish their energy for the ongoing fight. That night, they slept comfortably around the fire, and the next day, they began building a shelter. Nate cleared a space and constructed a fireplace with stones, while Robert and Ben built walls using branches and covered everything with peat moss. The result was a well-sealed and spacious shelter, arguably the strongest yet. They divided the musk ox hide into 3 parts for bedding, enhancing warmth as they slept on it. By the 8th day, all the musk ox meat had been smoked and cooked, except for a piece of fat which they had buried in the mud. Nate noted that the fat smelled just as fresh as when it was buried, but they needed a container to render it into oil. They found some clay and planned to make a few clay bowls. They shaped the bowls by the river and then dried them by the fire. While eating roasted meat and waiting for the bowls to dry, the clay bowls exploded. Making pottery was not as simple as they thought. Ben came up with the idea to use the burned musk ox bones. He ground them into powder and mixed the calcium and residues into the clay, which helped strengthen it. This time, the clay bowls did not explode. Using the bowls, they rendered the fat into oil. Eating only dried beef was making their bodies weaker. With the intake of this fat, they could continue to sustain themselves more effectively. Previously, Ben had found a fan-shaped stone by the river. He sharpened its edge and used charcoal to burn a groove in the top of a piece of wood, then tied it with musk ox hair rope to make an axe. Civilization seemed to advance 1,000,000 years in that moment. By the 20th day, they had consumed all the musk ox fat and felt significantly weaker. To continue supplementing their fat intake, they had to fish in the lake. They honed musk ox bones into hooks, placed bait in the middle indentation, and made fishing lines from the dried sinews. All 3 went to the lake to fish, but unfortunately, high winds and waves were not conducive for fishing, and they caught nothing for 4 days. Just when they thought they would return empty-handed again that day, they passed through the forest and saw a squirrel. Trying to catch it as an addition to their meal, Ben, without a proper weapon, threw a stone and unexpectedly knocked the squirrel down. He proved worthy of being the brother of the deer king Jordan with such a feat. Compared to the very dry and smoky musk ox meat, the squirrel meat was tender and moist. They used the squirrel's innards as bait and returned to the lake to fish. After waiting another 2 or 3 hours just as they were about to give up, Nate got a bite. He pulled a 5-pound fish out of the lake, and Ben excitedly knocked it out with a couple of strong hits to the head. This fish ensured they could end their challenge decently. Ben and Nate happily carried the fish back to camp, delighting Robert, who had stayed behind. They cleaned the fish and eagerly ate the heart before roasting the large chunks over a fire. The fish tasted much better than the dried beef. They all enjoyed the unexpected delicacy and felt their energy returning. On the 30th day, the time to leave, they dismantled the shelter and took the remaining supplies. The trio, with their perfect teamwork, easily completed the challenge and won the prize money. Next, 3 new contestants appeared. Using the location marked by the production team's flare, they did not hesitate upon leaving the yacht and sprinted towards the prey, a sizable musk ox lying in a clearing in the forest. Without even a screwdriver, processing the tough-skinned musk ox was a challenge. Luckily, there were plenty of rocks by the lake, though most crumbled easily and were not suitable for making stone blades. Philip, who teaches primitive skills, is adept at making tools, starting fires, building shelters, and hunting. Shane, a retired veteran who had worked in a tannery, knew all the processes of animal butchery and took the lead in dissecting the muskox. Anne, a biologist with a penchant for cleanliness, assisted them. Philip found a large suitable rock for making cutting tools. As the only one in the team with the skills to make fire using primitive methods, he knew the importance of fire for warmth, protection, and preserving the muskox meat was paramount. He decided to simplify the process by making the simplest hand drill. He tested branches against his face for coolness to ensure they were dry enough, necessary for finding other branches if they were not. At home, Philip could start a fire in 15 to 30 minutes, but in the cold, damp Arctic conditions, the hand drill seemed completely ineffective. Shane and Anne also encountered difficulties. They accidentally punctured the muskox intestines in several places, risking contamination of the meat with exposed feces. They also disagreed on techniques, wasting much time just removing the stomach and intestines. Seeing that the hand drill was ineffective, Philip decided to try making a bow drill instead. He dug up spruce roots from the ground, which were tough and long enough to serve as cordage, and assembled it to see if it would work better. Although it required less effort, the drill stick frequently flew out. Shane and Anne finally removed all the muskox's internal organs, but the sun was already setting. They joined Philip to try to start a fire. Whether it was the unsuitable materials or the high humidity in the air, they struggled until dark without success. The next day, they covered the musk ox with moss to shield it from sunlight and slow down decomposition. All 3 made hand drills and tried to start a fire, with Philip eventually succeeding in producing embers. Securing fire, critical for their survival next to food, was a relief after many exhausting hours. The first thing they did with the fire was cook. They sliced the heart, skewered it, and roasted it until charred. The food was unappealing but tasted surprisingly good. With the fire going, dissecting the muskox became easier. The 2 men quickly removed the legs, and Anne was responsible for slicing the large pieces of meat and hanging them on a tripod made by Philip. As long as no bears interfered, they could smoothly smoke the meat and effectively win by lying down. However, in wilderness survival, expecting the unexpected is standard. On the 3rd day, it began raining from early morning. They had not yet built a shelter, so everyone got soaked. Fortunately, they were all in good physical condition and did not catch colds. However, the smoked meat got wet, posing a risk of mold and spoilage. Their task for the day was to build a shelter. They collected a large amount of wood, made 2 tripods with a horizontal beam in between, and used sloping wood on the sides to create the classic lean-to shelter frame. They then covered it with branches and moss. They implemented a shift system. 2 slept while 1 kept the fire and stood guard, continuously smoking the meat day and night. By the 7th day, only the ox's stomach remained unprocessed. Shane suggested cutting it in half to use as a container for boiling water. Philip wanted to eat the meat inside to replenish their carbohydrates, knowing its high nutritional value. To him, it seemed like a waste to discard it, and it even smelled slightly like cauliflower. Philip roasted it on a stone slab and invited Shane to join him. Seeing Shane stay 10 meters away, Philip did not insist and enjoyed the meal with Anne instead. Despite its unappealing appearance, the taste was even worse, evident from their disgusted expressions. Anne, having not washed for several days, was uncomfortable and worried about getting sick from unsanitary conditions. She decided to make some soap. They mixed wood ash and ox fat with water, heated it, added charcoal powder, stirred it well, and shaped it into balls to cool down, creating emergency wilderness soap. While not perfect, it was somewhat effective, and at least Anne managed to clean her hands and face. Just using one smoking rack was too slow for processing the meat, so Philip built another based on the pine tree. Shane wanted to make a blanket out of the musk ox hide. Even though it was summer in the Arctic, the nighttime temperatures were still very low. By removing the layer of fat under the hide and letting it dry for a few days, he could finish the blanket. The stone blade Shane was using had dulled over time, and he asked Philip to make a new one at the lake. Before leaving, Philip asked him to keep an eye on the smoking rack. However, within 5 minutes of his departure, the rack caught fire. Shane and Anne noticed too late to save much. They could only watch as the fire completely consumed the rack and the dried meat inside. Philip was at a loss for words when he returned to see the charred remains. If a bear came to steal food again, surviving 30 days on muskox meat would be very difficult. By the 13th day, Philip was experiencing stomach pain, likely due to the monotony of eating dried beef and rationing it cautiously. Anne thought they could utilize the ox horns by grinding them into powder to sprinkle on their food for some minerals. The grinding task fell to Philip, with no offer of help from his partners. Unfortunately, the minimal nutrients from the muskox horns did not improve his condition, which worsened. Philip ended up vomiting on camera, and by the 15th day, he had to withdraw from the competition. Shane and Anne were reluctant to see him go, as Philip was the only one with extensive wilderness survival skills. Without his help, hunting for fresh meat would become even more challenging. The next day, Shane found moose droppings not far from camp. It was mating season for moose, making them more aggressive and dangerous without weapons. That night, a moose actually entered their camp, bellowing angrily, posing a potential threat to Shane and Anne. But thankfully, it returned to the forest after venting its anger. Over the next few days, both felt their weight dropping and their strength waning. Shane suggested making meat patties mixed with berries and ox fat to increase their fat and vitamin intake. He mashed the cooked beef with a large bone, while Anne extracted fat using marrow and fat tissue. They crushed cranberries, mixed them with the minced meat, and formed patties. The combination of meat and berries was far tastier than the dried beef. On the 22nd day, Shane and Anne planned to hunt squirrels in the forest, the most likely catch in the area. However, they argued during the hunt and came back empty-handed after wasting a lot of energy. Since they couldn't catch land animals, they tried fishing in the lake by constructing a wooden trap with an entrance and baiting it with bones smeared with meat scraps. Unfortunately, after checking daily for over a week, they found the trap empty and Shane's shoes got wet and cold. With the muskox meat gone and unable to catch fish, they had to survive on berries and moss until the 30th day. Shane and Anne ultimately completed the challenge. They dismantled their shelter, extinguished the fire, and took the musk ox hide and spears as mementos. Anne fired a flare into the sky to mark the end of their challenge. The next 3 contestants, following the production team's flare, found a crocodile after trekking 200 meters. Although the crocodile was an adult, it wouldn't last them a month. In the swamp, the body would decompose quickly, so they couldn't delay the dissection. Jason and Hudson took on the task of dismembering the crocodile, while Pick was tasked with making fire, a skill he taught for a living. Hudson, drawn to nature, and Jason, a retired Special Forces operative, both entered the competition to test their skills and resilience. They needed cutting tools, but the swamp had no stones, so they settled for sharp shells to attempt cutting the crocodile's skin, which proved difficult even at its softest part. Pick collected many branches suspended under trees, which were much drier than those exposed or on the ground. He chose to use a hand drill for fire starting, the most direct and simplest method. He used a trumpet vine for the base, soft enough to make a hole with a shell, and chose the stem of a goldenrod for the spindle, its straight shell enclosing cotton-like pith that would help produce friction and embers. As the crocodile skin remained uncut under the efforts with shells, Jason thought of using reeds as a knife. Reeds contain high concentrations of silica, and he managed to strip out a piece with a sharp edge. This makeshift tool finally succeeded in cutting through the crocodile skin, and they quickly proceeded with the skinning, especially since Pick was making good progress. Despite the humidity, he managed to create embers and start a fire on the first day, a feat not previously achieved. In the swamp, where one perspires more, staying hydrated is crucial. Pick only found stagnant or dirty water, which was risky to drink directly. A viable solution was filtration. He dug a hole a few meters away from the stagnant water using a stick and filtered water through the soil. Impatient for the water to settle and clear, he scooped it up by hand to drink. With the help of the reed knife, processing the crocodile advanced rapidly. They cut the meat into small pieces. It's worth noting the highly developed muscles of the crocodile. Even hours after death, touching it could trigger nerve reactions. Due to limited resources, they planned to repurpose the crocodile's jawbone as a tool later. Jason and Hudson efficiently processed the entire crocodile before nightfall. They planned to smoke and dehydrate the meat. Pick constructed a wooden frame to hang the thinly sliced meat for smoking, while they also prepared their dinner with chunks of crocodile meat skewered and roasted, finding it firmer, juicier, and tastier than the musk ox meat. They planned to take turns resting, needing to smoke the meat continuously over 24 hours to preserve it before spoilage. They buried the crocodile head in the charcoal overnight, hoping to soften the bones by morning for use as tools. However, they were dismayed to find the crocodile head completely charred by morning, complicating their situation with limited resources. Today, they planned to finish building their shelter. The rainy climate made it crucial not to remain exposed for long. Choosing a campsite was also critical. Too low and it could flood. They found an ideal spot on higher ground with a slanted tree trunk to serve as a natural beam. They just needed to lay some branches on the sides and seal it with palm leaves and reeds. They worked until dusk, with only the roof left to cover. They had to sleep under the open sky, but fortunately it didn't rain that night. However, as the saying goes, what you fear comes. And by early morning the next day, dark clouds gathered. Completing the roof became urgent. Just then, Hudson announced his need to withdraw due to poor health, feeling dizzy, having headaches and foot pain, and struggling to adapt to the swamp conditions. His teammates were disappointed, but had to accept his decision. Luckily, Pick and Jason managed to finish the roof with palm leaves just before the rain started. That night, the sky thundered, and heavy rain poured until morning. Water accumulated around the shelter, and they had to keep the fire going while digging trenches to drain the water. The lean-to shelter was not completely protective against the storm, and some of the smoked meat got wet, risking mold and spoilage. Pick and Jason decided to eat the wet meat immediately rather than risk it spoiling later. After the rain stopped, they discovered that part of the crocodile tail they had hung on a tree branch was missing. In this area, only a crocodile could have dragged away such a heavy item. They had not anticipated such an incident. As night fell, the rain resumed relentlessly. A large tree next to the shelter, weakened by the wind, seemed on the verge of falling. Pick and Jason spent the night anxiously, unable to sleep. And by morning they saw cracks in the tree, indicating it was only a matter of time before it fell. Concerned about the danger of staying nearby, they decided, despite their exhaustion, to relocate and build a new shelter. They chose a larger tree as the center for their new shelter, building a circular barrier of branches around it and covering it with palm leaves. They created a tent-like structure that offered better waterproofing, ensuring the smoked meat wouldn't get wet again. They also utilized the crocodile skin by sewing it into a bag with grass rope to store the dried meat. By the 15th day, their limited crocodile meat was insufficient. Both had lost 10 pounds and needed to find new food sources. The swamp was abundant with cattails, whose roots are rich in starch and carbohydrates and are quite palatable raw. On his way back from eating cattails, Jason spotted a rabbit lying motionless in the grass. He broke off a tree branch, approached stealthily, and successfully hunted the rabbit, rejoicing at the thought of a hearty meal. However, when they skinned the rabbit, they found it riddled with parasites. Likely the reason it was so easily caught, probably too sick to escape. Fearing infection, Jason and Pick threw the rabbit far away. Despite the setback, the swamp teemed with life, and other food sources weren't hard to find. While collecting firewood, Jason encountered a water moccasin snake. He called Pick for help, and together they managed to kill it with a stick. After cleaning it, they roasted the snake, which turned out white and tender, easily falling off the bone and tasting similar to chicken. A pleasant surprise. By the 23rd day, only 2 pieces of crocodile meat remained. After these were consumed, they would have to rely entirely on their own foraging. Pick made several ropes from the inner bark of trees, intending to use them for traps. They bent saplings for tension and tied slip knots at the ends of the ropes, smoothed with crocodile fat for slickness, waiting for prey to be caught. The remaining crocodile fat had gone rancid, unfit for eating but useful for extracting oil. They soaked this oil into the cattails, creating torches that could serve as candles at night. By the 28th day, when Pick checked the traps, they finally caught a rat, which had many fleas known to carry diseases. They burned off its fur before cooking, then skinned it and cleaned out the insides before roasting it. The cooked rat was golden brown, tender, and tasted surprisingly like squirrel meat, not as unpleasant as expected. Both enjoyed every bite of protein. Pick and Jason persevered to the 30th day, extinguished the fire, dismantled the shelter, and set off a flare by the river to signal the successful end of their segment. The last 3 contestants found themselves in the hot, humid Louisiana swamp, following a flare to a wild boar half submerged in water. Weighing only around 100 pounds, it was modest compared to the large musk oxen and moose of previous challenges. They dragged the carcass to nearby land for easier processing, unable to find stones sharp enough to cut it. They searched the water for shells. Donnie, who had participated in the 6th season of Alone and withdrew due to a heart attack, hoped to redeem his reputation this time. He found 2 shells in the mud around the tree roots, sharpened their edges against each other, and began cutting the boar's skin. Contestant Sean, a retired veteran, learned from his military career the ethos of never abandoning or giving up, which he also sees as the essence of wilderness survival. It is well known that wild boar skin is thick and tough. After a few minutes of trying with shells, they hardly made any progress in cutting through the boar's belly. Matt, having spent 10 years studying nature and plants, recalled seeing reeds by the river on their way in and suggested trying them. Reeds contain silica, a major component of glass, and he believed that if they could thin the reed stalk sufficiently, they could use them as knives. Sean took the reed knife Matt crafted and found it much more effective than the shells. Donnie felt he wasn't much help with the butchering, so he took on the responsibility of starting a fire. He used dry cypress bark, an excellent fibrous material, shredded it into fine tinder, and then found some red bushes to tear the bark off for making cordage for a bow drill. As he was about to start, it began to rain, complicating his task. Donnie persevered through the rain, attempting to create embers, a task as likely as the sun rising from the west. Fortunately, his other 2 teammates did well, and by the time the rain stopped and the skies cleared, the boar had been fully processed. Now, they had to race against time to light a fire and smoke the pork to dehydrate it before it spoiled. Donnie remade the hand drill, and the 3 men took turns continuously rubbing to create friction. After much effort, they finally saw smoke rising from the base. Flames burst forth from their hands, and they quickly set up a tripod, cutting the pork into slices and hanging it to smoke. Only then could they relax as the freshly smoked pork jerky became their dinner. After hours of hard work, they were famished and found the meat exceptionally delicious. That night, the 3 men slept around the fire on palm leaves. The next day, they decided to build a shelter, planning a low, conical tent because the swamp nights were cold, and a smaller space would better retain heat. Some fresh wood was too tough to break, so they burned it in the fire to make it manageable. While Donnie and Sean busied themselves happily, Matt took a peculiar interest in the boar's eyes. In a gesture of respect for their prey, he chose to eat the eyes to know the boar's past. It was unclear what he learned from eating the boar's eyes, but he ended up crying and became passive and idle. As daylight dwindled, Donnie and Sean worked diligently tying palm leaves to the framework, while Matt nonchalantly played with frogs on the ground, frustrating his teammates. Despite Matt's lack of participation, they completed the shelter before dark. The next day, Sean focused on the boar's head, wanting to use the skull for tools. Unable to clean the meat off with the reed knife, he placed the skinned head in the water, letting the swamp creatures assist in cleaning it. By the 8th day, Matt was only collecting firewood and watching the fire, not taking survival seriously and showing minor health issues, appearing lethargic all day. 2 days later, he clutched his chest and leaned against a tree root, unable to speak clearly. His partners, very concerned, had no choice but to fire a signal flare to get the production team to take him for medical treatment. Donnie suspected that the filtered water Matt drank wasn't clean enough, which might have caused his illness. He used tree bark as a conduit and built a water trough with clay partitions to plan on drinking rainwater thereafter. By the 15th day, the smoked pork had become tough and hard to chew. Eating it meal after meal was unbearable for their jaws, so they decided to make fish traps. They collected branches and vines to weave 2 fish traps, one larger and one smaller, and used bone with meat scraps as bait, placing them in both deep and shallow water areas. They also made weapons for active hunting, utilizing the boar's tusks. By knocking and shaping with tree sticks, they crafted a good knife and broke the remaining boar skull to extract small bone pieces, which they tied to reed stalks with pigskin rope to make spears, creating classic atlatls. Donnie and Sean split up to search the swamp, but after more than an hour, aside from an unavoidable crocodile, they saw no trace of other animals, wasting several hundred calories in the process. By the 25th day, they had finished all the pork. Luckily, they had yet to check the fish traps and held high hopes for catching some small fish or shrimp. However, when they retrieved the traps, they found them completely empty. As they pondered their next steps, Donnie spotted an opossum in the grass ahead. He ran back to camp, grabbed a weapon, and chased the opossum, quickly incapacitating it with several strikes. Overjoyed by this unexpected catch, they immediately cleaned and cooked the opossum on the fire. After not having fresh meat for over 2 weeks, the taste was incredibly delicious, dense, fatty, and irresistible, a real treat for their long-suffering stomachs. With this opossum helping them through the last few days, Donnie and Sean successfully completed the survival challenge and won the coveted $300,000 prize.